Okay, we are live on the air. I'm Ed Brayton, here with some friends of mine to talk about today's Supreme Court rulings. I think particularly the Hobby Lobby ruling is probably of more interest to those in the room and to those who might be watching. I'm sure everybody has heard by now the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 today that that a closely held corporation could not be required under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to provide what? Oh, hold on. It just started broadcasting on me back in my face. Oh. That was weird. Anyway, they ruled that Hobby Lobby and other closely held corporations could not be forced by the government to provide contraception as part of their group insurance, health insurance packages. It's a ruling that obviously has been very highly anticipated by people on both sides of the matter. And as a general rule, the conservative religious side won today. But I don't think it's quite as complete a victory as they would have wanted, or nearly as broad a ruling. So why don't we just start out with you guys kind of giving your perspective on the ruling. What do you think of it? We'll start with Alex there on the left.
I'm supremely disappointed that they didn't tack on at the end the same sort of thing that they have for overtly religious groups, like Catholic schools like they had before. That would have been one step toward ending this bizarre connection the U.S. has between who people work for and where their health care comes from, which is what they really need to fix.
A fair point. Mm-hmm. Dan?
I have more questions than I have knowledge about it. I just think that it's dubious where there's that room that they were very clear that they're not saying every possible faith claim that a corporation makes would be valid, but that's also double-edged because you can tell that they might be doing that to carve out so that they can make rulings which favor certain religions they want to favor and ones that don't, and not favor others. And so even that part which sounded like they're saying there's still ways to curb the religious expression of corporations, it was still nebulous and left room for a bad interpretation. That was the first impression.
Yeah, you know what? Why don't we stop there and talk about that so we don't lose that point, because I think it's really important. It certainly is nebulous. I mean, they didn't, except in the case of anti-discrimination laws, when they did say, look, this doesn't mean that a company can claim a religious exemption in order to get out of the application of the Civil Rights Act, for example, and fire people because they're of a different religion or different race or different gender and so forth. They did say, when they mentioned that, they specifically said the government clearly has a compelling state interest in forbidding discrimination. So they laid out a very clear case for why this ruling would not apply to that situation. But there are lots of other potential applications of it that involve specifically health insurance. You know, can a company that's owned by Jehovah's Witnesses say we're not going to cover blood transfusions? You know, can someone who is against vaccination say we're not going to cover vaccinations? Can a company that is anti-gay say we're not going to cover HIV antiretroviral medications? Those are all really interesting questions which the court didn't answer. They sort of said this ruling doesn't mean that you can get a religious exemption in those cases. But that doesn't mean that it won't mean that. They were simply saying that those issues are not before us right now. So, you know, we don't need to decide how far-reaching this will be. It is fairly nebulous, I think. Although I'm encouraged. You have to understand how the law works on this. This law was decided not on the basis of this ruling was decided not on the basis of the Constitution, but on the basis of something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? And what RFRA does is it tells the court, you are empowered to grant exemptions on the grounds of religion, to grant exemptions from generally applicable laws, if that law poses, and these are legal terms of art, a, quote, significant burden on the free exercise of religion, and the standard that it orders the courts to apply in those cases is the law in question, is the regulation of conduct, the least restrictive means of achieving that compelling state interest? That's a standard that has to be applied case by case. And so the court was right to say, we're not deciding this. If a Jehovah's Witness-owned company were to come to us and say that, we would then have to weigh out that compelling state interest. My guess is that in a case like that, they would say no to that religious accommodation on the grounds of herd immunity and that sort of thing. Yes, there is a clear public health interest in vaccinations, for example. Yeah. Possibly in the case of blood transfusions as well.
I think it's clear that they, well, it seems to me that they did not want this to be a precedent-setting ruling. They made it very limited in its scope, almost so that they wouldn't be setting a precedent. It seems like they're saying this applies only to birth control and only to private health companies with specific religious beliefs. And they actually say in the ruling that it does not apply to hiring practice regarding race,
right?
Large public health companies, nonprofits, so on and so forth. So,
well, the case, it sets a precedent, but yeah, I think it was pretty clear they didn't have the votes to go beyond a very narrow precedent, and that encourages me, because I have no doubt that if they had the votes to go further than that, they would have. And so I think that Kennedy, who wrote a concurring opinion, while he agreed with the majority opinion, he wrote a concurring opinion really going into detail about how narrow this ruling is. So my suspicion is that the 4 serious conservatives on the court all wanted to go further, and Kennedy said, if you do that, I'm siding with the liberals, and we're going to, you're going to lose.
Can I ask you guys a substantive question, though?
Sure.
And that is, and this was something that Ed and I have talked about this before, and the question, what they were saying was, there is a interest, and they said they assumed there was an interest in promoting birth control, which I thought was a good sign. I don't know what that means to assume it, but that was good that they didn't contest that. Then the question, though, is, are they right? Do we think that there isn't a better, that we might as well not try it a different way that didn't cause any religious freedom conflict, even if we don't think corporations deserve religious rights? Is it valid to say, why not err on the side of caution and have the state just find another means? What do you guys think of that? Was this really necessary that the state use these means?
I think you're right. I mean, and this is something perhaps I should have pointed out earlier. When the court decided this, they didn't decide it on the grounds of not being of contraception access not being a compelling state interest. They ruled on the grounds of it not being the least restrictive means of achieving that interest, and the ruling actually mentioned 2 ways that the same goal could be achieved without forcing a religiously owned company to pay for what they object to religiously. One of those ways is the government could simply pay for it. And the government could simply say, we're going to pay for insurance coverage for everybody. They could also say insurance companies have to provide contraception coverage across the board to anyone who has health insurance outside of the group insurance policy. The most interesting one, and I think this just occurred to me about a half an hour ago, and I checked this out with a buddy of mine who teaches constitutional law, and he confirmed this with me. The court said, look, the HHS could do what they did for religious nonprofits, which is there is an accommodation for their religious beliefs that says, if you religiously object to including contraception in your group insurance policies, all you have to do is tell us that. Sign a piece of paper saying we have religious objections to that, and that triggers an accommodation whereby the health insurance provider itself has to then give a rider that provides contraception coverage free of charge to all employees who want it. So they said you could do that. That's perfectly constitutional. Here's the really interesting thing. This is what I just figured out about a half an hour ago. That accommodation was not part of the original law. That accommodation was written into the implementation regulations by the Department of Health and Human Services. In fact, they wrote it twice. They came up with one, and then they slightly broadened it. That means that Obama could tomorrow simply rewrite those implementation regulations and say we're going to extend that, the accommodation that we've given to religious nonprofits, and give it to religious for-profits as well. Problem solved. Case mooted. Everybody gets free access to, everybody who has health insurance then gets free insurance coverage for contraception. Now that would be challenged in court as well, of course, and there's about 80 or 90 different legal challenges going on right now from religious nonprofits saying that even that accommodation doesn't isn't enough for them.
But it seems to me that what Kennedy wrote in his in what is it called again, when in his final
his concurrence,
that it seemed to me that what Kennedy wrote there, it suggests that he's closing the door on those religious. He's saying that he's almost saying this does not apply to them, and it won't apply to them, I think.
No, actually, I think the exact opposite. The court went out of its way to say there is a less restrictive means, and that is to simply broaden that accommodation. Now, that really strongly suggests that next term, in a few months, when those cases, all those cases involving religious nonprofits that are challenging that accommodation come up, they can't call that unconstitutional now. Because they just said, here's a constitutional means of doing this. And not just Kennedy's, but Alito's majority ruling is really, really clear on this. It says 2 or 3 times, here is a perfectly legitimate way you can do this. So I think what this means is all of those cases, and there's dozens and dozens, maybe over 100 of them, from religious nonprofits and universities and so forth, all of those cases they're going to lose, almost certainly. And this provides a pathway for the Obama administration to change that accommodation and guarantee the contraception coverage without Congress having to do anything. So I think there's a really clear path out of this for how they can make this work and make this constitutional and essentially make this ruling meaningless.
Right.
That's
what I was saying. I was kind of saying that Kennedy goes out of his way in the direction to say that accommodation does not burden the religious exercise rights. So
right, exactly. That accommodation is not a significant burden. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you said we meant the opposite. Yeah. So, I think that's the really interesting thing, and it didn't occur to me until about a half hour ago that was the case. You know, that this could something that Obama could change without. Now, here's the possible downside of that. That also could provide a means for the court to get out of the contradiction. So let's say those, next term, a couple of those religious nonprofit challenges to the accommodation come to the court. Potentially, they could say, no, that's unconstitutional too. Not because it burdens religious freedom, but because the regulations were issued by the executive branch and it wasn't part of the original law. Only Congress has the authority to do that, not the executive branch.
Oh. It seems to me that Kennedy, who would be the swing vote on this,
sure.
He kind of, I think he put that in there to say, rest assured, that everything's going to work out here.
I suspect that's true. I don't think that. I don't think that's a winning argument. I mean, I think that I think there's actually pretty good news coming from this.
Yeah.
Let's say hi to Gretchen and Eve. Welcome, Gretchen. Haven't seen you in far too long.
Thanks.
I'm glad we have a couple of women in here because when I looked at this a few minutes, I'm like, we got nothing but men in here talking about something that affects women enormously. So I'm glad to have you guys in here.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I haven't used this computer in a long time either. In this this way. So thanks for that explanation. I just heard that second part of it. But did you guys already talk about potential implications for other rights besides contraceptive use, and like whether or not that same argument could be made for anything else, like vaccines or?
Yeah, the court said this does not apply in those other cases, but that doesn't mean it actually wouldn't apply if a case came up.
And that's what I'm worried about, yeah. Because I'm worried that, okay, this particular case, yes, doesn't say anything about anything else besides contraceptive use, but like IUDs and that sort of thing. But what happens when the next case comes up that, uses the same arguments, and wouldn't they have to have the same opinion basically because of that?
No, not necessarily, because each sort of demand for an exemption gets weighed individually, and the court has to decide, is there a compelling state interest in having this policy in place? Is this the least restrictive means of achieving that interest? Okay. So in the case of vaccinations, I'm 90% sure that the court would say, yes, there clearly is a compelling interest in protecting public health.
And by the way, it's important to say that those interests are outlined by Human Health and Services. So the court has to take into account what Human Health and Services, the HHS, that's kind of where they get the interest from. Oh, okay. Right?
Yeah,
I wasn't sure about that.
They don't have to, but they're going to give some weight to that, certainly. Right. Somebody left a really interesting comment on my Facebook page about this, because I was going on about how I think this is a really narrow ruling that applies only to this, and a woman friend of mine said, that's not a feature, that's a bug. Yeah. What that really means is, they said, this only applies to things that affect women, so screw women.
Right.
That's a pretty fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and let's not forget how they came down recently on equal pay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, clearly the opinion is very anti-woman. I mean, there's any question about that.
That's what frustrates me most. It's not even like before the Affordable Care Act, it was a lot harder to get access to contraceptives. So at this point, like, we're still a step ahead than I was when I was born, for example. But I'm still absolutely furious because of the direction this is sort of leading. The reason all men, basically decided that, we think that religious views are more important to consider rather than, women's health generally, basically. And it's like, as somebody who's not religious, that argument doesn't make any sense. And it's just really sad that this sort of basic human health issue isn't respected in the same way to everybody. I mean, even some of the issues like whether or not someone could have access to an IUD is pretty ridiculous, because whether or not you have an IUD, that IUDs are perhaps sometimes used for abortion, sort of for almost like a Plan B kind of option, but they're also used to prevent pregnancy and prevent unwanted pregnancies as well. Like, some of these cases that like, people use IUDs for contraceptive purposes, not strictly for Plan B, abortive purposes.
How could you use them for a Plan B? I don't. Because it's not like you can insert them after you've had sex.
Yeah, you can. You can. Yeah. The copper one particularly is effective immediately and has a similar effect, although it's way more expensive than Plan B, and it's a non-hormonal option that you can use after basically. But
you can't insert them yourself, right?
No.
Yeah, because
it's like a procedure that you need to be evaluated for and that sort of thing. So you can do it like with an emergency circumstance, but
okay.
And it's really expensive. There's sometimes like, I think mine was like $500. So and that was through Planned Parenthood. And now I had insurance, so I was able to get it for free. But that's just because of the fact that I got insurance recently through the ACA, and I didn't have to worry about it. So
yeah, and you're absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely legitimate for you to be furious about this. I'm furious about it too. I think there was someone on my Facebook page today that sort of thought that maybe I wasn't outraged enough about it because I was sort of analyzing the legal minutia, but that's just what fascinates me. I'm a geek, so. But yeah, I mean, this is a horrible ruling, and I, my hope, my sort of farthest out hope would be that they just overturn the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Yeah. Because I don't think that religion should be granted this special privilege of getting out of laws. That was never going to happen. The government, the Obama administration, didn't make that argument. They didn't make that argument at all. There was one brief filed on behalf of several atheist groups that made that argument, but since it wasn't raised by any of the parties to the case, that was a pipe dream. But I really, my sort of more realistic hope was that they would rule that that this just isn't a significant burden on anybody's religious freedom anyway. Case closed. But I think that we probably got the best ruling we could have reasonably expected to get out of this court. So
yeah,
I mean,
I
that's
read
a cloud. You know,
I read that
line.
Yeah, I read that blog post you made, and so I understand where you're coming from on that, definitely. You know, it just, I guess there's a lot of angst around everything because of the buffer zone ruling, and then this one, and then just recent, you know, just all those cases recently, and then also the fact that, like, I want corporations to not stand in the way of what the people want, and I'm tired of corporations having the upper hand, basically, in every case. Like, you know, this has nothing to, like, this is not religious, it shouldn't be a religious institution, and the fact that they are able to make some decisions for what kind of health insurance people get is, you know, ridiculous. I mean, that should have nothing to do with it. But I don't know, whatever. I think, you know, ever since Citizens United, this stuff just keeps coming, and you know, corporations are people with religious rights, and they have, you know, all these sort of other rights that end up stepping on the rights of individual actual Americans that are citizens and vote. And the problem is now that we have Supreme Court rulings, it's so much harder to get some of these issues and these rulings reversed, you know, through normal legislative means, because Congress is so fucked up. So we kind of have no options anymore to actually have, you know, be represented in a way that's meaningful, and it's really frustrating because that's what happened. So it's now up to the Supreme Court to tell us basically how we're going to live and move forward, and Congress isn't going to change anything like that. So.
That's why I was so glad when, like, you know, an hour ago it suddenly occurred to me that the accommodation plan was not part of the bill. Congress doesn't have to act to change that. Obama could. And then I was like, oh, there we go. That makes this much better. Because if we were going to wait for Congress to do it, pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
But what you said raised, I think, another interesting question. I'd like to bring other people in on this. Yeah, and I've had some people say this to me, and I think they're right. The real problem here is that we have tied health insurance to employment.
Yeah.
Well, you know, that if we didn't tie health insurance exclusively to employment, this wouldn't happen. Now, Alex, you're an American, but you live in Canada.
Correct.
So you have up there, you know, an entirely single-payer healthcare system. I mean, I imagine you have strong thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's downright ridiculous that in the United States your employer is even remotely relevant to your access to healthcare. That this is an idea that is completely bizarre to anyone that's up here. And when Americans describe to Canadians what they have to deal with to get their health needs covered, it's you get the same look that Americans give Mexicans when they talk about the drug war. You know, it's really that ridiculous, just the disparity between the two. And as an American up there, I'm only myself covered because I'm a university student. I know other Americans that are cut out of the system entirely, and they're in some ways worse off than Americans in the U.S.
Because they have to travel so far if they're not covered under Canadian health.
Yeah, right? And there's a very small number of private insurers in Canada that deal specifically with that market, which naturally they have cornered, so they exploit it heavily. Yeah, it is bizarre, and a lot of this nonsense will go away as soon as the United States gets its head out of its nether orifice and detaches healthcare from employment.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think that's anytime soon. I mean, we couldn't even pass a public option. The bill that we got, which is subsidized private health insurance, was the only thing that could realistically pass, and it barely passed by one vote as it was. Because, and the real, if we're going to take even one step further back and look at this from sort of 90 miles up, the real problem here is the influence of money in politics.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Insurance companies, basically what Obama did when he got into office, and this was his first priority, and he had advocated for a public option, was that he very quickly found out from the Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill that there was no chance in hell that was going to pass, that the insurance companies would have spent any amount of money to prevent that from happening. And now, of course, because of Citizens United and Free Speech Now and other rulings, they can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence this process. And so the best thing he could hope for was essentially to buy off the insurance companies. We'll give you 30 million new customers, we'll subsidize their ability to pay the premiums, and you don't try hard to kill this. And they basically agreed to that. So I don't think we're getting single payer anytime soon.
Alas.
Unfortunately, Welcome, Shanna.
Hello.
I was just saying, I'm glad we're finally getting a few women in here as we're talking about women's health care. It's probably, since it was all men in the Supreme Court that ruled this in the first place, it probably shouldn't be all men talking about it. Right?
I had to explain a little bit about what IUDs were to the group.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I never asked questions when I had mine installed, so.
Take it like a champ, huh?
My girlfriend had a nice publicly funded one. It was magnificent.
Here's another question that occurred to me a little while ago. Oh, hello? Oh, I thought it was Anya talking in the background, right? So here's another question that occurred to me. This could end up being a good thing for Democrats, who are looking at some pretty big losses in November, or were. Could this really light a fire under female voters in particular? I mean, turnout goes down in a midterm election. I wouldn't be surprised to see women showing up at the polls to vote in the numbers, in the percentages that you see in a presidential election year this November, because they're rightly going to be furious about it.
I'm not so sure about that. And I'll let the women here speak for themselves on that, but I suspect a small enough fraction of employed women are dealing with this specific issue that it may not be as much of a driver as we would like. But that's my intuition.
Even if they're not affected personally by it, I think the optics of this, that 5 old white men way past, well, not all white men, actually, but 5 old men way past childbearing age are making decisions for women, that doesn't look good. And there have been several articles I've seen today that said, Hobby Lobby may have won this battle, but the Christian right didn't do themselves any favors here, and it may actually make the already big problem that the Republicans have attracting female voters. It might make it worse, and I'll be curious to see if that happens in November. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
It'll certainly make it worse, it seems.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be significant to, as you were saying, that prevent the big losses that we might expect. But it'll certainly make it worse. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense for it not to, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Gretchen, what were you going to say?
Unfortunately, I think the general public doesn't tie. It thinks that the Supreme Court is more or less basically nonpartisan, and I know that's not actually the case, but I think generally people would not tie this necessarily. I mean, the Democrats didn't even tie the government shutdown entirely on the Republicans. I mean, a lot of us did, but not everybody. And it should have been 100% them. So I think. Well, while I hope that more people go out to vote, and I've been trying to canvass a little bit with our Pride here in Minneapolis for GLBT issues, which basically similar overlap. It seems like people care. People have been more informed. I think every year people are more informed about what their vote means, but they also weirdly start to realize that their vote also doesn't mean as much as they think it should, because of the fact that they're not represented because of money. And so there's this weird catch-22 where it's like, well, voting is important, but can we really do anything about it? So maybe I shouldn't, because it's going to happen either way without me, and these people are going to be crazy without me or with me. So I don't know. I don't know. You guys should tell me what you guys think, but I don't think the average voter ties the Supreme Court to any sort of partisan politics.
I don't know either.
I really do expect, though, that the Democrats are going to be all over this. And I think particularly in some of the key swing Senate races. Because they now have this very powerful argument in Senate races in particular, because the Senate is who votes on judicial nominees. Is to say, look, if the Democrats lose the Senate and the Republicans take over, Obama's done getting through his judicial nominees. And if one of the Supreme Court justices were to die or step down, Obama might not even be able to name a replacement at all. They might just delay it until the end of his term and not take a vote. That's a really powerful argument.
That's a scary, scary thing.
Yes.
But that's a powerful argument brought out a lot, though. I mean, like, when I first started kind of criticizing the two parties, like, thinking in my mind, what are really common refrains just in my life that I've heard a gazillion times for the candidates that I've known, had the opportunity to vote for, or give my opinion as to how somebody should vote on that. But it seems like that's a really common thing, like the Supreme Court. It's trotted out definitely every presidential election.
Sure.
Not so much in midterms, but I just don't know. And I think, who is it? I'm sorry if I don't know your name. Gretchen.
Yep.
I think Gretchen's totally right. I think that the majority of people, especially of women who would not be voting for Democrats already, that would want to vote, whether or not that demographic of women are impacted deeply enough right now, all things considered, to really care. And then to add upon the relevancy of the topic, to say it was 5 men and 4 of them were Catholic, that's going to be like, most of them, I don't think they care. Like, I don't think it's on their radar. I think they care in a very abstract way and occasionally personally, but only when it really hurts them. And the question then would be, is it hurting them right now? And would those numbers match up with the potential number of voters who may be so encouraged by this to go out and vote? And I don't know what those numbers are, but I wouldn't bring it.
I think there are so many issues that should convince people to vote that don't. And so which was different, but not always the case.
But I think you're right too, Ed. Like, the Democrats, it would be ridiculous for the Democrats not to use this. And I mean, just recognizing the game and saying that it's being played right now, that elections are happening, and that these kind of things factor into the rhetoric.
And the fact that the ruling happens so close to the election. The election is less than 4 months away.
Right.
So, I think that there's sort of a strike while the iron is hot here. It's not very often that I'm the optimist in any room.
Yeah.
But I think, if it just were enough to get a 5% boost in the number of women to the polls in a couple of key Senate races, that could be enough, because it's going to be really close. If the Republicans take control of the Senate, it's going to be 51-49, So we don't have to have this have a huge effect in order for it to have a huge effect, So, like I said, I'm not used to being the optimist in almost any room, as cynical as I am, but I'm hopeful of that, and I hope the Democrats are really strong on this.
Well, when's the last time you've seen a Democrat actually take one of these issues and hammer it home, like in a way that, vibrates all the way through all of the media? Boehner says one thing and everybody talks about it, but Harry Reid whispers something and people are like, oh, we don't care, it's Harry Reid. So I mean, like, maybe I just don't hear the same stuff, or don't listen to the right stuff, but I feel like the right is so much louder on any of these issues. And in this case, if the right says something, they're going to mess it up, and they're going to say the wrong thing, and they're going to turn people off again. But the left probably won't be super loud and obnoxious in their face about it, because they tend to be a little bit more like passive and, well, I guess we can work together on this, and like.
Well, I'll give you one race where I think it could make a difference is Kentucky. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader.
Yeah. His
opponent's a woman, and I would bet that she's going to be all over this. If she's not, she needs to fire her. I mean, she should have a campaign commercial out already on this.
She definitely needs to use this.
Use there in Kentucky, yeah. So.
how would you frame it to to women in Kentucky? Like how would you pitch that to a more conservative female base in Kentucky as over against conservative base or bases of women in more?
Tell them that someone else is trying to decide what happens in your uterus.
Yeah, I think the argument stays pretty much the same. Not like women in Kentucky have less desire to control their own bodies. And that's going to be a really close race. I mean, the polls are showing it just neck and neck at this point. So if they could end up knocking off the Senate minority leader, that's big, especially if it's a woman that knocks him off, And I'll say this as well. It's also, we shouldn't put all this onus on women to do this.
Right.
Men need to be out there marching for this and organizing for this and helping get the word out on this, because this is a basic, principle issue, whether it affects us personally or not.
Yeah, as far as the pitch of the argument, I don't think that it's going to really matter, because the only women who are not going to see it as strong or effective is what I would think. I would think it would be more of fundies, who seem to be under the impression that they should be submissive to man anyway. So
I think
that's what I was saying, because it's in Kentucky, and that's why I was saying, like, if we're talking about, it's mainly just fundies. We got to say, listen, Kentucky, where the great museum is, like, they're giving money to this thing. I mean, this is like culturally, Kentucky would be quite conservative. And let me say this just real quick, like, if that is already a pitch and a narrative when people say rightly that it's a woman's body, you shouldn't be invading areas. Men should not make those decisions. Those are all, in my opinion, they're right. But it's not like those. I don't think it's a fill in the blank thing that might work for. My position would be that maybe it works for some women, but I think certain people with certain worldviews and certain moral foundations might be they might not be quite so quick on that and have a hesitancy. So in that, for instance, can it be formulated in such a way to make it relevant? Or is that like, I don't know if it's difficult.
Two things I want to throw in there. First one is, even in these circles, I suspect a lot of people would be miffed at the idea that one's employer is making that decision as opposed to, say, one's husband. So we could, if we were trying to win a more conservative crowd, spin it that way. The other thing is that a much bigger difficulty is going to be whole crowds of people where their employer gets between them and their health care, and they figure, meh, I can get it anyway. By some other means, buying it over the counter, etc., because they're privileged enough that this is an option for them, so they don't see the further down that where it'll become more restricted, or where that level of restriction is enough to lock a whole series of people out of it because they're not those people. There's a sense of simply not understanding what's at stake here that I think will affect large numbers of people. And to say nothing about people that have managed to get private insurance that covers this stuff, and so find the employer angle irrelevant.
Let's let Eve get in here, because she actually lives in Kentucky, so.
Well, I was just going to say that as far as Kentucky being considered fundy, on the Bible Belt and everything, I think that people outside of Kentucky need to realize that there is a shift going on in Kentucky. Just by noticing from my own experience that there's a shift happening within politics, within the atheist communities in Kentucky are standing up for the rights of individuals and things like that. So, yeah, there's hope for Kentucky.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing that maybe could help push that swing a little bit. And like I said, this race is going to be really close, that race for McConnell's seat. So a couple thousand votes could make the difference here, So it doesn't have to. You don't have to have a huge effect to have a huge effect.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gretchen.
Never mind. I just was trying to remember about that, a little bit more about that race. It's fine. Never mind. I remember.
I can't remember the name of the woman that's running against him, but
Yeah.
but there's been a few polls where she's been up by 3 or 4 points, and some others that have, showed it really, really tight. So if we could knock off the Senate Minority Leader, that's a pretty big scalp on the wall, so to speak. So what else? Anybody else have any questions about this or thoughts on this?
I had a question for you.
Okay.
The minority opinion. If I can go back to that, if that's what you're talking about. You were saying that it's not as bad as it could have been. In fact, all things considered, it's probably the best, even more than we could have imagined. First question: do you think that there are any indications from within the majority opinion that can give us any idea for how this might be applied as a precedent, right? Soft or whatever, narrow or wide, that how it might be applied if and when other maybe not the vaccines, of course, we mentioned those earlier, but hypothetical others that could possibly come forward. Does this particular ruling give us any kind of indication for how they'll rule? And then secondly do you think the minority opinion in this was good, and do you think it brought up the best arguments and the best ideas, and how that might affect the future of the argument if and when it ever comes back up?
Let me do the second one first. I think the minority opinion is certainly right about the wrong basis for it, although I do think it was really overstating the broadness of the ruling. Allison Grimes, that's right. Thank you, Eve, and thanks for coming in. I think that Ginsburg was kind of exaggerating for rhetorical effect on the broadness of the ruling. I don't think it's nearly as broad as some of the opponents of the ruling have made it out to be. Having said that, as we talked about, up front in this thing, there's some things that are really up in the air. You can think of hypothetical situations and go, I don't really know how they'd rule on that. Well, how would they rule on blood transfusions? My guess is that they still would say no, that they wouldn't apply a religious exemption there because they would say, look, this has a direct, immediate effect. Somebody could die, like, tomorrow if they don't get a blood transfusion,
Okay.
So my suspicion is that they don't have the votes. I don't think Kennedy would go for that. Another question that somebody brought up earlier today that I thought was really interesting in that regard was, what if it hadn't been a Christian business? What if it was a Muslim-owned business that said that? How would they have voted that? We don't know, and we can't know, but it's an interesting question.
I think it would depend how many Christian businesses filed briefs on this particular case.
Yeah, that may be true. That may be true.
Is the court more corporatist, or are they more religious? That's what I wonder.
Both. I'm not sure they separate the two. A lot of them, I don't think they don't see a distinction necessarily between the two. A lot of a thing has also been made about this. I've heard from people about the fact that there are 6 Catholics on the court, and Catholics are against contraception. I actually tend to think that argument's a little overblown. I mean, Sotomayor is a Catholic,
But she made the right calculation and said that women's health is more important than her particular religious views on the matter. So, right? I mean, so.
Right. And the conservatives on the court have done the same thing in other cases. I mean, the Catholic Church is strongly anti-death penalty, and yet they're all pro-death penalty. So I don't think that the fact that they're Catholics necessarily controls. Yeah. I think it has much more to do with ideology. Than political ideology than it does with Catholicism itself. But interesting to note that the first Catholic ever on the court was, less than a century ago.
I don't think that we should belittle the religious effect on some of our Supreme Court justices. I mean, Antonin Scalia at one point he said that. And I'm sure, Ed, you've heard of this. Antonin Scalia said, it's funny how, or it's strange that we don't see as much interaction between miracles and God as we did in the Bible. And then he goes, and then he somehow tied it all into the devil. Hold on, I gotta see if I could find this quote.
Yeah, he said that he does believe in a literal devil.
Right. He believes that he is working on the planet, that there are people who work for him.
Yes.
Yeah, but that is, how do you apply that to public policy or constitutional questions? I mean, yes, he's got a strange religious belief, but that hasn't kept him from bucking his own church in not only in death penalty cases but in torture cases. So I don't. There certainly isn't a clear nexus between their religious beliefs and their resulting rulings.
I think in the mind of Catholics, that's pretty nuanced, though. For American Catholics, the certain things like the church on the death penalty and different things like that would be, in their minds, what they call an ordinary magisterium. It means that it's just the teaching authority of the church. It's more casual teaching authority in their mind. And whereas other things would be categorized differently. Though both are from the church, and even though you can open up a catechism and say, well, what does the Catholic Church say it believes in their mind anyway, there's a lot of freedom, and they don't interpret that as being any less Catholic. In fact, they think they're doing that because they're more conservatively Catholic than even Rome. You know? May or may not be true. But
well, I mean, political orientation or like political partisanship isn't independent from your religious views, because they end up feeding into each other, and often like they're consistent with each other. So the right basically represents a whole bunch of religious views in the country, and it's this weird conglomeration of like evangelicals and Catholics that decide all these things for the right, basically. Like they decide how the right's going to deal with these questions that come up legislatively. So I think Ed's right in the sense that like this is a political ideology thing, and that's why they're voting in this way. That's why they're deciding in this way. But it's unfortunate because their religious views back that up, and like in their own personal minds, when they're at the ballot box, they have no, or when they're voting on issues, our legislators, they will think about their own views and whether or not their own conscience is going to be a problem with their laws. But it just happens that now religious views and ideology are so hand in hand where it isn't a concern anymore, and they can vote without worrying that their conscience is being validated. So
it's worth pointing out that Catholicism is such a huge religion with such an enormous diversity of backgrounds for its adherents that it's in many cases not even all that practical to think of it as one religion.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. I suspect you could almost imagine Sotomayor and the other Catholics on the Supreme Court as belonging to entirely different religions, and I suspect their actual attitudes make more sense in that context than if we attribute them to holding the same authority.
It was on display in cases against the nuns, or anything involving issues related to the progressive nuns.
Right.
What are they with, Ed? You'd know maybe the name of it.
Yeah, I can't remember, but they're one of the cases that involving religious nonprofits that is in the appeals court now involves a group called the Little Sisters of the Poor, which has always been kind of a punchline in stand-up comedy, but there actually is an organization called the Little Sisters of the Poor, and they filed suit against the contraception mandate, saying that the accommodation isn't good enough, that because they have to sign a piece of paper saying we object religiously to this mandate, that is what triggers the birth control being provided by the insurance company, and that violates their religious freedom. It's a usually weak argument, but that's the argument that they're making, and that actually does involve a group of nuns.
Well, they have to sign a waiver that allows their employees to get a third-party insurance company to provide the coverage on behalf of the company. So they're saying that signing the waiver itself violates their religious
Right.
belief.
Right. The accommodation isn't accommodating.
At this point, they're daring the rest of the system to just remove employment from consideration.
Right.
But I mean,
Well,
this is the quote. This is to me I mean, just listen to this quote, okay? This is Scalia. In the gospel, the devil is doing all sorts of things. He's making pigs run off cliffs. He's possessing people and whatnot, and that doesn't happen very much anymore. What he's doing now is getting people not to believe in him or in God. He's much more successful that way. So here's a guy who has this dualistic, theology that the world is divided into good and evil. And when you start down that road, you're going to be looking at bills and ruling on stuff like this, right? You're going to be this is definitely going to affect how he decides cases, If the world is divided into good and evil, oh, this is an evil bill. It's obvious. this is an evil plaintiff or whatever.
I think I just brain farted. There was something else I was going to bring up and get you guys' thoughts on.
The unions?
Oh, the other possibility, I think, is the other sort of accommodation that they said could happen here was, or the way around this would be just have the government pay for it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And I'm even if we don't ever get single payer, I've argued for years that birth control should be free for everyone in this country.
Here.
It would save us billions and billions of dollars. The insurance companies, you notice that when they announce that accommodation that says for all of these religious nonprofits, you don't have to provide it to your group plan, but insurance companies have to provide a rider that covers it and they can't charge for it. You didn't hear a peep out of the insurance companies about that being terrible because they want everyone to have insurance, to have contraception coverage. It would be in every policy they write if they had a choice. But because corporations and organizations get to determine what's in their group policy, it doesn't always get included. But it saves them a fortune. They'd much rather provide birth control pills.
Kind of in the middle of something.
Then I'm going to mute you here for a second there, Alexander. But they would much rather pay for $30 a month birth control pills than to pay the cost of prenatal care and delivery and postnatal care and 18 years worth of health insurance for for a child. So maybe there might be some movement toward that.
But then there's the slippery slope into, well, the government's going to cover cancer patients, and
Yeah, how terrible would that be?
Right.
That's a slippery slope to people actually being healthy. And
Exactly. That's the point. That's
what if global warming's a hoax and we've made a better world for nothing?
But that's what we've reduced this argument to, is that people are so against this notion.
Right.
It's unbelievable to me.
Another thing that was mentioned, you mentioned slippery slope, and I kind of got into an argument on my Facebook page with somebody about this today, that they were saying, well, sure, the court's pretending now that it's not about anything other than contraception, but a year from now or 2 years from now that could go away. And they brought up specifically the ruling in Lawrence v. Texas, which was the one that overturned state sodomy laws, where Justice Kennedy said this doesn't have anything to do with gay marriage. This is just about whether you can throw somebody in jail for consensual homosexual sex. And Justice Scalia, in his dissent from that, said this is going to lead directly to gay marriage. Kind of did. Now that's true, but as I pointed out to him, look, the slippery slope doesn't always happen. I mean, we all said the same thing, or liberals said the same thing 4 years ago when the Heller decision came down on the Second Amendment. Oh, so much for gun control laws. They're all going to be struck down now. Hasn't happened. In fact, the courts have upheld every gun control law that's been challenged since then. Could there be a slippery slope? Of course. but it isn't a certainty. And I think the fact that this one is based on statutory interpretation rather than constitutional interpretation kind of lessens that a bit. And Congress is always in control of it. Congress could always amend or repeal RFRA. That's not going to happen. But they could amend it just to put a specific exception in there for contraception. But not likely to happen. But I don't think it's going to need to. Like I said, I think Obama's going to go ahead and amend the accommodation rule and essentially make this a meaningless ruling, which would be a great outcome.
Turns out.
So Dan, you've been awfully quiet. You said you had a bunch of questions. Do you have anything else to throw in here?
No, not particularly. You've covered most of it.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, then I guess we will wrap this up. And we've had about 15 people watching this throughout the thing, so you've all become big stars.
Yeah.
All you've been on. So thank your agent and all the little people for making this possible. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and
Thanks, Ed.
do this again. So.
Good night, bud.
Bye.